Leah Anderson blended into the crowd at the basketball game, her heart racing as her eyes tracked the dangerous criminal she had been pursuing for months. But just as she prepared to make her move, she felt a rough hand on her shoulder. The last thing she expected, as an FBI agent on the verge of closing a case, was to find herself in handcuffs, arrested by the very people meant to uphold the law. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The arena hummed with excitement as fans poured in, their voices blending into a rising crescendo of cheers and laughter. The bright lights shone down on the basketball court, creating a stark contrast to the shadowy corners of the stands, where Agent Leah Anderson sat, calmly scanning the crowd. She wasn't here for the game. While everyone else's attention was fixed on the players, Leah's eyes were locked onto a different target, a notorious figure she had been tracking for months. Her heart thumped steadily, her pulse synced with the rhythm of the game, but her mind remained sharp and focused. Leah blended into the crowd seamlessly, her dark hoodie pulled low over her face, her jeans and sneakers making her indistinguishable from any other fan. It was a carefully crafted disguise, perfected over her years in the field. Tonight, she had to be invisible. Just another face in a sea of excitement. Her target had chosen this game to blend in, but Leah was more than prepared. She had the patience and training to wait for the right moment, to let him make the mistake of thinking he was safe. But as she kept her eyes on her mark, a ripple of tension disturbed the atmosphere around her. Leah felt it before she saw it. The shift in energy, the sense of something going wrong. A group of local police officers, their uniforms crisp and their postures authoritative, moved through the crowd. At first, they seemed to be on a routine patrol, but Leah quickly noticed their eyes lingered too long on certain people, their expressions hardening as they passed by Black and Latino fans. Leah's instincts kicked in. She remained motionless, hoping to avoid drawing attention, but the officers were moving closer, and their focus seemed to lock onto her. Without warning, one of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sneer on his face, nodded to his colleagues. They changed course and began moving directly toward her. Leah's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't panic. She was trained for high-pressure situations, but this was different. She was here to catch a criminal, not become the focus of unwanted attention. The officers stopped just in front of her, blocking her view of the court and her target. "You got some ID on you?" The voice of Sergeant Rick Thompson was cold and condescending. Leah looked up, her calm mask still in place, but inside, frustration simmered. She recognized the look in his eyes, suspicion, bias, and a complete lack of respect. "I'm here undercover," Leah said quietly, keeping her voice steady. "I'm working. You're interrupting an operation." But her words only seemed to fuel Thompson's arrogance. He chuckled, exchanging a look with one of the other officers. "Undercover, huh? You look more like you're up to something. Let's see some identification." Leah hesitated. Revealing her identity could blow her cover, ruin months of careful planning. But it was clear that these officers weren't going to leave her alone. With a slow, deliberate movement, she reached for her badge, hoping it would put an end to the situation quickly. But Thompson wasn't interested in her credentials. Before she could even pull it out, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, yanking her to her feet. "I don't care what story you're spinning. We'll sort it out at the station." The world around Leah seemed to slow. She could feel eyes on her, the confusion and curiosity of the crowd growing. She knew the longer this scene played out, the more attention it would draw. Her target would surely notice. But more than that, Leah felt the familiar sting of humiliation creeping up her spine. This wasn't about procedure or law. It was about power, about assumptions based on the color of her skin. They didn't believe her, didn't even give her a chance to explain. The officers roughly escorted her through the crowd, their grip on her arms tight and unnecessary. Leah clenched her jaw, keeping her emotions in check. She had dealt with this before, the subtle and not-so-subtle racism that often came with her position. But this was different. This was public. She could hear the whispers in the crowd, feel the judgmental stares, not just from strangers, but from the very people who should have been protecting her. As she was led past the rows of seats, Leah caught a glimpse of her target, slipping through an exit on the opposite side of the arena. Her heart sank. The criminal she had been tracking, the one she was so close to apprehending, was gone. All because a group of officers couldn't see past their own biases. By the time Leah was dragged outside and shoved into the back of a police cruiser, her mind was racing. She had to stay calm, had to think. She couldn't afford to let her emotions take control. But the anger was there, simmering just beneath the surface, not just for herself, but for every black person who had ever been subjected to this kind of treatment. As the cruiser pulled away from the arena, Leah stared out the window, her hands still cuffed behind her back. The lights of the city blurred in her vision, but her thoughts were sharp. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. They might have humiliated her in front of the crowd, but karma had a way of coming full circle. The officers had made a mistake, a big one, and soon they would find out just how wrong they had been. The tension was palpable as the police car sped toward the station, the hum of the engine, the only sound filling the heavy silence. Leah sat in the back, her mind racing with a mix of frustration and determination. She had been through difficult situations before, but this was different. This time, she wasn't fighting just a criminal. She was fighting an entire system of prejudice and ignorance that had unfairly singled her out. Her mission wasn't just about catching one man. It was about proving that, no matter what, justice could prevail, even in the face of injustice. Leah took a deep breath, knowing that the next chapter of her fight was about to begin. The fluorescent lights in the station flickered overhead, casting a harsh glow on the sterile walls of the holding room. Leah sat on a metal bench, her wrists sore from the tightness of the cuffs. The door slammed shut behind her, and the hollow sound echoed in the small space, amplifying the isolation she felt in this moment. She had been sitting here for what felt like hours, left to wait as the officers outside continued their business, oblivious to the gravity of their actions. Leah was no stranger to pressure. She had faced down some of the most dangerous criminals in her career. But here, in the confines of this room, she was facing something much more insidious. The weight of assumptions, the ignorance that led to this humiliating arrest. It wasn't about her skill, her badge, or even the law. It was about the skin she was born into, the assumptions these officers made the moment they saw her. Sergeant Thompson stood on the other side of the one-way glass, arms crossed, his eyes locked on Leah through the reflective surface. He hadn't said much since bringing her in, but his mind was made up from the beginning. Leah had seen it in his eyes at the arena, the smirk that played on his lips when he pulled her from her seat. He didn't see an FBI agent. He saw what he wanted to see. A suspicious black woman who didn't belong at a basketball game, let alone in his station. Leah clenched her fists, fighting the urge to lash out. She knew better. Anger wouldn't get her anywhere in this moment. She had to remain calm, had to stay focused. But it was difficult when every moment in this room was a reminder of how powerless she felt. Despite the badge she had spent years earning, the door creaked open, and Sergeant Thompson strolled in, his steps deliberate and heavy. He leaned against the wall, arms still crossed, studying her with a look of amusement. "So," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "you're telling me you're FBI? That's quite the story." Leah raised her chin, her eyes meeting his with an unwavering stare. "It's not a story. I'm Special Agent Leah Anderson. I was working undercover at that game, and you've compromised a federal investigation." Thompson's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Federal investigation, huh? You don't look like any FBI agent I've ever met." There it was again, the assumption, the stereotype. Leah felt a familiar pang of frustration, but she didn't flinch. She had dealt with men like Thompson her entire career, men who judged her based on their narrow worldview, not her abilities. "I'm sure you've read about me," Leah replied, her voice steady. "Or you will once you make the call. And trust me, when you do, you'll realize just how big of a mistake you've made." Thompson snorted, pushing off the wall and pacing the small room. He circled Leah like a predator, but she didn't move, her posture confident despite the situation. "You've got quite the attitude for someone sitting in cuffs," he muttered. Leah didn't respond. She knew she didn't need to justify herself to him. The truth would come out soon enough. The silence stretched on, tense and uncomfortable. Finally, Thompson stopped in front of her, his eyes narrowing. Let's just say, hypothetically, that you are who you claim to be. Why should I believe you? Why should I let you go? Leah felt her temper flare, but she kept it in check. She had to choose her words carefully. Because it's the truth. And when you make that call to my superiors, you'll not only have to answer for your actions tonight, but you'll also have to explain why you let a dangerous criminal slip away. Thompson's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, and Leah knew she had hit a nerve. For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by arrogance. Dangerous criminal, huh? He echoed, but there was less certainty in his voice now. Leah pressed on. Yes, the man I was tracking has been on our radar for months. He was at that game tonight, and thanks to you, he's gone. You've compromised the entire operation. Thompson stood still, his face unreadable. Leah could see the gears turning in his mind, the slow realization that maybe, just maybe, he had overstepped. But his pride wouldn't let him admit it, not yet. Tell you what, Thompson finally said, turning toward the door. I'll make that call. But until I hear otherwise, you're staying put, and if it turns out you're lying. He left the threat hanging in the air as he walked out, slamming the door behind him. Alone again, Leah let out a slow breath, her pulse still racing. She could feel the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She was stronger than that. She had to be. As she sat in the silence, her mind drifted back to her early days at the FBI. She had been warned about moments like this, about the struggles she would face as a black woman in law enforcement, but hearing about it and living it were two different things. She remembered the looks of surprise when she first joined the bureau, the comments from some of her colleagues that she'd have to toughen up if she wanted to make it. And she had, for the most part. But tonight felt like a step backward, a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. Leah closed her eyes, steadying herself. This was just one battle in a much larger war. She knew that when this was over, when her name was cleared, she would continue fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been in her shoes. For the people who didn't have a badge to protect them, who couldn't call on the FBI to prove their worth. But first, she had to get out of here. Hours passed, and Leah remained in the room, waiting for the inevitable call from her supervisor. She knew it would come, but the waiting gnawed at her. Finally, the door opened again, and she looked up to see another officer, this one younger, looking uncertain as he stepped inside. Agent Anderson? He said hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Your supervisor is on the line. They've, cleared everything up. You're free to go. Leah stood slowly, her wrists still aching from the cuffs. The officer fumbled with the key, freeing her hands before stepping aside to let her pass. As she walked toward the exit, her mind raced with conflicting emotions: relief, anger, frustration. Sergeant Thompson was waiting for her outside, his face set in a tight, forced expression of regret. But Leah didn't stop to acknowledge him. She walked past him without a word, knowing that the weight of his assumptions had already done enough damage. She had her freedom. But the real fight was far from over. Leah stepped out of the station and into the cool night air, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She had been freed, but the bitterness of the night's events clung to her, a constant reminder of the prejudice she still faced, even as a federal agent. Her target was gone, the investigation compromised, but there would be another day. Another chance. And as she walked away from the station, she couldn't help but think of the reckoning that awaited Sergeant Thompson. Karma had a way of catching up to those who thought they were untouchable. Leah stepped out of the police station, the cold night air wrapping around her like a blanket of reality, harsh and unforgiving. She rubbed her wrists, still tender from the handcuffs, trying to shake the feeling of helplessness that had washed over her during the night. As an FBI agent, she had faced danger, hostility, and criminal threats, but nothing prepared her for the humiliation she had just endured from the very people sworn to protect and serve. The phone in her pocket buzzed, breaking the silence. Leah pulled it out and saw her supervisor's name flash on the screen. She answered, her voice steady despite the chaos she felt inside. "Leah, it's Darnell. came the familiar, gruff voice of Special Agent Darnell Harper, her mentor and boss. He sounded calm but concerned. "I've been informed about what happened. Are you okay?" Leah hesitated, unsure how to explain the mixture of anger, frustration, and humiliation brewing inside her. "I'm fine," she said finally, though even she wasn't convinced. The words felt hollow, like a reflex. "I'll be filing a formal complaint against that sergeant and his team," Darnell continued. "They had no right at all to treat you like that. We're going to make sure this doesn't go unanswered." Leah clenched her jaw, the memory of Sergeant Thompson's smug face flashing in her mind. His dismissiveness, the way he had looked at her with disdain, as though her FBI badge meant nothing to him. As though she meant nothing. "It wasn't just a mistake, Darnell," Leah said softly. "It's what they believed about me before they even knew who I was." It's more than that." "I know," Darnell said, his voice grim. "But we're going to fix this. You rest tonight. We'll regroup in the morning, figure out how we can get back on track with the investigation." Leah thanked him and hung up. But the idea of rest felt impossible. She looked down the quiet, empty street, feeling the weight of the night settling deep in her bones. Her target had slipped through her fingers, her operation had been compromised, and she had been reduced to an object of suspicion, simply because of the color of her skin. The sting of it lingered, leaving her exhausted and restless at the same time. Hailing a cab, Leah sank into the back seat, her mind racing. She replayed the night's events. Every glance from the officers, every dismissive word from Thompson, the disbelief in their eyes when they learned who she really was. None of it should have happened. She had done everything by the book, and yet she had ended up in handcuffs, accused of being the very thing she was there to stop. The cab pulled up to her apartment building, and Leah stepped out, thanking the driver and heading up the stairs to her unit. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt a wave of exhaustion. She dropped her bag on the couch and collapsed into a chair, staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights of the police station still seemed to linger in her vision, harsh and unforgiving. Leah reached for her laptop, opening it up to file her report. The Bureau would need a full account of what happened, both for the investigation and for the internal review that was sure to follow. She typed, her fingers moving quickly over the keys, recounting everything from the moment she arrived at the basketball game to when she was forced into the back of the police car. Her words came out in short, clipped sentences, reflecting the cold efficiency she had learned to use in these moments. But beneath the surface, her emotions churned. As she typed, her mind wandered back to the moments leading up to her arrest. She had been so close, her target was within sight, the operation was running smoothly. She had spent months preparing, gathering intel, building the case, and in an instant, all of that was ripped away, not because of a mistake she made, but because of assumptions that had nothing to do with her abilities as an agent. When Leah finally finished her report, she saved it and closed the laptop. But sleep still eluded her. The adrenaline that had surged through her earlier had worn off, leaving a hollow ache in its place. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. It was quiet now, the streets mostly empty, but Leah could still feel the pulse of the night, the undercurrent of tension that never seemed to leave. She thought about Thompson and the way he had looked at her, not as an equal, not even as someone worthy of respect, but as a threat, a problem. And all because of his assumptions about who she was, what she represented. The thought made her stomach churn. She knew she wasn't the only one who had been treated like this. If it could happen to her, an FBI agent, what happened to the countless others who didn't have the protection of a badge? Leah turned away from the window, a heaviness settling over her. This wasn't just about the criminal she had lost that night. It wasn't just about a botched investigation. It was about something deeper. The ingrained prejudice that people like Sergeant Thompson carried with them, the bias that seeped into every part of their interactions with people who looked like her. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen. This time it was an email from Darnell. Attached were the official statements from the police department. Leah's name was cleared, but the damage had been done. The officers who had arrested her had been informed of her position, and an internal investigation was now underway. Thompson's actions were under scrutiny. Leah didn't feel any satisfaction from reading the email. Instead, it felt hollow, like a bandage on a wound that went far deeper than the surface. Sure, the formalities were being handled. The department would apologize, Thompson would likely be reprimanded, but none of that would change what had happened, or the systemic issues that allowed it to happen in the first place. The next morning came too quickly. Leah hadn't slept, her mind too full of thoughts to let her rest. When she arrived at the FBI office, Darnell was waiting for her, his expression serious. "They've opened an inquiry into Thompson's conduct," he said without preamble. "We're going to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Leah nodded. "Good, but we need to talk about the investigation. I want back on it." Darnell's eyebrows rose. "Leah, after last night—" "I don't care," Leah interrupted, her voice firm. "We can't let this guy slip through the cracks because of what happened. I've spent too long on this case to let it fall apart now." Darnell studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, we'll put together a new strategy, but I want you to take a few days off, clear your head." Leah didn't argue. She knew Darnell was right. She needed time to process everything that had happened, but she also knew that the fight wasn't over. Not for her, not for the people who faced prejudice every day, and not for the investigation that had been derailed by it. As Leah sat at her desk, reviewing the case files, she couldn't help but think of the reckoning that was coming. Not just for Thompson, but for everyone who thought they could operate under a cloud of bias and get away with it. The truth had unfolded, but there was more to come. Karma had a way of catching up with those who deserved it, and Leah knew that Thompson's day of reckoning was only just beginning. Sergeant Rick Thompson had always prided himself on his ability to read people. He'd been a cop for over 2 decades, climbing the ranks by maintaining order, making the tough decisions, and enforcing the law with an iron fist. At least, that was how he saw himself. In reality, Thompson's career had been built on assumptions. Assumptions about the people he dealt with, about who was a threat and who wasn't. But those assumptions were about to catch up with him, and for the first time in his life, Thompson would face consequences he couldn't simply brush aside. The morning after Leah's release, Thompson sat at his desk, going through the motions of his routine. His smugness from the night before had waned slightly, replaced with a subtle tension he couldn't quite shake. The look on Agent Anderson's face as she left the station had stuck with him, her cold, silent stare that seemed to see straight through him. It unnerved him, though he'd never admit it. He brushed it off, telling himself that he'd done nothing wrong. She hadn't looked like an FBI agent. She'd looked suspicious. He was just doing his job. But as he sat there, reviewing the arrest report, the knot in his stomach tightened. Something felt off, and it wasn't long before his phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. "Sergeant Thompson, Internal Affairs is here to see you," came the voice of the station's front desk officer. Thompson's grip on the phone tightened. Internal Affairs. That wasn't a call he got often, or ever, if he could help it. He leaned back in his chair, trying to maintain an air of calm, though his heart had picked up its pace. "Send them in," he said, keeping his voice steady. Moments later, 2 plainclothes officers from Internal Affairs walked into his office. They weren't smiling. "Sergeant Thompson." The taller of the 2 men began, his voice professional but curt. "We're here to discuss your actions from last night. The Bureau has filed a formal complaint against you and your team for the unlawful detention of Special Agent Leah Anderson." Thompson's face remained neutral, though inside he could feel the heat rising. "I was just following protocol," he replied. "She was acting suspiciously at the game, and when we approached her, she didn't cooperate. I had no reason to believe she was FBI." The IA officer gave him a measured look. "We've reviewed the footage from the arrest, Sergeant. We saw how you interacted with her, how you dismissed her attempts to show her badge, and how you treated her with unnecessary force. This wasn't just about procedure." Thompson's stomach churned. The footage, he had forgotten about the body cameras they wore, the ones that recorded every second of his interaction with Leah. He had been so caught up in his assumptions, so sure that his authority wouldn't be questioned, that he hadn't even thought about the cameras capturing the entire incident. Now, That footage was working against him. The second IA officer spoke up, his voice calm but firm. The Bureau has made it clear that they want this incident investigated thoroughly. We'll be conducting interviews with the officers involved, including you. There are also reports from other citizens in the crowd that witnessed the arrest. It's not looking good. Thompson's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. I was just doing my job. How was I supposed to know she was FBI? It's not about her being FBI, the first officer said. It's about how you treated her, how you let your assumptions guide your actions. And it's not the first time complaints have been made about you, Sergeant. Thompson stiffened. Complaints? From who? There have been several reports over the years, the officer continued, mostly from minority communities, claims of racial profiling, unnecessary force, targeting individuals without probable cause. Thompson's pulse quickened. Those are unfounded accusations, he said, his voice rising. I've always followed the law. The IA officers exchanged a look, and the tension in the room grew thicker. We're going to get to the bottom of this, Sergeant, the second officer said. For now, you're suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Thompson stared at them, his heart sinking. Suspended? You can't be serious. We are, the first officer said firmly. This is serious, and we suggest you cooperate fully if you want any chance of keeping your job. The two officers stood, leaving Thompson alone in his office. The door closed with a quiet click, but the sound felt like a hammer blow to Thompson's chest. Suspended. His career, the one he had spent years building, was now hanging by a thread. And all because of a single night, a single moment of arrogance and prejudice that he hadn't thought twice about. Thompson sat back in his chair, staring at the report on his desk, but seeing none of the words. His mind was racing, trying to find a way to rationalize what had happened, to convince himself that he hadn't done anything wrong. But the truth was gnawing at him, tearing at the carefully constructed image of himself he had held onto for so long. He had assumed. He had judged Leah Anderson based on her appearance, on his own ingrained biases, and now it was all coming back to haunt him. The complaints, the footage, the internal investigation, everything was collapsing around him, and there was no easy way out. Thompson spent the next several days in limbo. He wasn't allowed back at the station, and the investigation moved forward quickly. Interviews were conducted with his fellow officers, statements were taken from witnesses at the basketball game. And all the while, Thompson felt the walls closing in. He received a letter from Internal Affairs informing him that his suspension was officially extended while they completed their review. Rumors swirled around the department, and the support he had once counted on from his colleagues began to wane. Some of them distanced themselves, unwilling to be caught up in the mess he had created. Days turned into weeks, and Thompson's life unraveled further. He could feel his reputation slipping away, the respect he had worked so hard to earn eroding with every new revelation. The complaints from the community, the ones he had always dismissed as baseless, now had weight. His arrogance, his willingness to judge without thought, had led him down this path, and there was no going back. One evening, Thompson sat in his living room, staring blankly at the television. The news was on, and to his horror, the story of his suspension had made it to the headlines. A local reporter stood outside the police station, talking about the internal investigation and the accusations of racial profiling. The camera cut to a brief interview with Leah Anderson, though she had remained professional and brief in her statements. Thompson watched as Leah spoke, her expression calm but firm. "This is about accountability," she said. "This is about ensuring that those in positions of authority do not abuse their power or allow prejudice to dictate their actions. It's important for all of us, whether in law enforcement or as citizens, to be held to the same standards of justice." Thompson's chest tightened as he listened. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had done. It wasn't just about losing his job or the embarrassment of the investigation. It was about the lives he had affected, the people he had mistreated because of his biases. It was about the trust he had broken, not only with the community but with himself. As the news report ended, Thompson sat in silence, the sound of the television fading into the background. For the first time in his career, he was forced to confront the reality of his actions. to face the reckoning that had been long overdue. The system he had served for so many years was finally holding him accountable, and there was no escaping the consequences. Thompson didn't know what the future held for him, but one thing was clear: karma had arrived, and it had no mercy for those who thought they were above it. Several months had passed since the investigation into Sergeant Rick Thompson had begun, and in that time, much had changed. The once confident officer had watched his life unravel, piece by piece, as the weight of his actions finally caught up with him. He had been formally dismissed from his position in the police force following a thorough investigation by Internal Affairs, which found that Thompson had not only racially profiled Special Agent Leah Anderson, but also had a pattern of discriminatory behavior throughout his career. The news of his dismissal had spread quickly, making headlines in local and national media. Thompson had become a symbol of the kind of systemic racism that was all too common in law enforcement, and his downfall was seen by many as a sign of progress, a rare instance where an officer was held accountable for their actions. But for Thompson, it was a painful reckoning, one that forced him to confront the truth about himself. Now, he sat in a small, sparsely furnished apartment, far removed from the life of authority and power he had once known. He had lost his job, his reputation, and many of the friendships he had thought were solid. Without the uniform and badge to hide behind, Thompson was left with little more than his thoughts. And they were not kind. He spent his days in solitude, haunted by the memories of the people he had wronged, the opportunities for change he had ignored. His mind often returned to that fateful night with Leah Anderson, the moment when his career had begun to unravel. He replayed the arrest in his head, realizing now, with painful clarity, how his assumptions and biases had led him to act without thinking, to judge without reason. But there was no going back. The damage had been done, and now Thompson was living with the consequences of his actions. He had tried to convince himself at first that he had only been doing his job, that he was enforcing the law. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it had never really been about the law. It had been about control, about power, and about his own inability to see people for who they really were. The former sergeant found himself attending court-mandated counseling sessions as part of the terms of his dismissal. At first, he resisted, convinced that he didn't need therapy or any kind of intervention. But as time passed, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. He started to listen, really listen, to the people around him, his counselor, other former officers who had made mistakes, and even civilians who had been victims of racial profiling. For the first time in his life, Thompson began to understand what it meant to be on the receiving end of the power dynamics he had once wielded so carelessly. He saw the humanity in the people he had once dismissed as criminals or threats, people like Leah Anderson, who had done nothing wrong but had been treated as though they didn't belong. One day, during a particularly difficult counseling session, Thompson spoke about Leah. He had avoided talking about her for months, too ashamed to admit the full extent of his actions. But something had shifted in him, and he finally allowed himself to confront the truth. "I didn't see her," Thompson said quietly, his voice hoarse from the weight of the admission. "I didn't see Leah Anderson for who she was. I saw her as a threat, as someone who didn't belong in that space, and I was wrong." His counselor nodded, giving him space to continue. "I've spent years, decades, really, thinking that I knew people the moment I laid eyes on them. I thought I could tell who was dangerous and who wasn't, just by looking at them. But I realize now I wasn't seeing people at all. I was seeing my own fears, my own biases, and because of that, I hurt people. I hurt Leah, and I've hurt others." The words felt heavy, but at the same time, there was a sense of relief in saying them out loud. For the first time, Thompson wasn't hiding from the truth. He wasn't justifying his actions or blaming others. He was taking responsibility. The counselor leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, Rick, but real change takes time. You have to be willing to do the work, to keep looking inward and asking yourself the hard questions. This isn't just about one incident. It's about a lifetime of choices. Are you ready for that?" Thompson hesitated, but then he nodded. "I am. I have to be." Meanwhile, across town, Leah Anderson had returned to her work at the FBI, though the events of that night still lingered in the back of her mind. The case she had been working on had finally been resolved. Her target had been apprehended weeks after the botched arrest, and justice had been served. But the personal toll of the incident remained. Leah had been back in the field, working undercover and handling high-stakes operations. But something had shifted within her. The experience with Sergeant Thompson had reminded her of the constant battles she and so many others faced, not just in the criminal world, but in everyday life. She had always known that being a black woman in law enforcement came with its own set of challenges, but the public nature of what she had endured made it even clearer how much work still needed to be done. One afternoon, as Leah was wrapping up paperwork in her office, she received a message from Darnell, her supervisor. "Meet me at the basketball court." It read. Leah frowned, but quickly grabbed her jacket and headed to the address he had given her. When she arrived, she saw Darnell standing near the entrance to an outdoor basketball court, watching a group of kids play. It was a sunny day, and the sound of bouncing basketballs and laughter filled the air. "What's this about?" Leah asked as she approached. Darnell smiled, his usual stern demeanor softening. "I wanted you to see something," he said, nodding toward the court. Leah followed his gaze and saw that several officers were mingling with the kids, playing basketball, handing out water bottles, and talking with the parents who had gathered to watch. It was a community outreach event, part of a new initiative the local police department had started in the wake of the Thompson investigation. The goal was to rebuild trust, to create real connections between law enforcement and the people they served. Leah's heart softened as she watched the interactions. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it wouldn't erase years of mistrust overnight, but it was a start. She had always believed in the possibility of change, and now she was seeing it in action. "I know it's not much," Darnell said, as though reading her thoughts. "But it's a step, and we've got more steps to take." Leah nodded, her eyes still on the court. "It's something," she agreed, "and maybe, just maybe, it'll make a difference." As they stood there watching the game unfold, Leah allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The night of her arrest had been a painful reminder of the prejudice that still existed, even in the ranks of law enforcement. But in the aftermath, something had shifted. There had been accountability, there had been consequences, and now there was hope for change. Leah knew that the fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, still people to be held accountable. But for now, she allowed herself to take in the small victories. She had emerged from that night stronger, more determined than ever to make a difference, not just in her work with the FBI, but in the larger fight for justice and equality. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the court, Leah turned to Darnell. "You know," she said, "I used to love playing basketball." Darnell raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" Leah grinned. "Yeah. You up for a game?" Darnell chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, Anderson, let's see what you've got." And with that, they joined the game, the sound of laughter and bouncing basketballs filling the air once again. It was a small moment, a simple act of joy in the midst of so much struggle, but for Leah it was a reminder of the power of resilience, of change, and of hope. The reckoning had come, but with it, so had the possibility for something better. And Leah Anderson was ready to keep fighting for it. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.